There are two things that we can be sure of about a movie adaptation of a book. The first is that Hollywood will keep making them. The second is that someone, somewhere, will always have a complaint about something that went wrong or something that should not have been changed. Usually it's fans, and often they do have a point. After all, why the hell would you include a random dwarf elf romantic subplot in the Hobbit movies? But I digress. Other times, it's the author of the book itself that hates what a studio has done to their work. That's when things get really fun. In this video, I want to take a look at authors that would end up hating what screenwriters and directors did to their works. Many of these movies are beloved classics, earned critical acclaim, or made heaps of money. Still, their authors took deep offense to the final work. 1971's Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is probably one of the most beloved films of all time. Directed by Mel Stewart and starring Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka, the movie was an adaptation of Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It follows a young boy, Charlie Bucket, who wins a golden ticket that gets him and some other kids access to Wonka's chocolate factory. It's a lively, vibrant, and favorite film of many, and Roald Dahl absolutely hated it. The book was written based on his experiences with chocolate factories in England, particularly Cadbury and Rowntree's. Dahl was fascinated at how jealously the companies protected their trade secrets and the actual machinery that went into producing the chocolate. When the movie was put into production, Dahl was on board as a screenwriter, but he failed to deliver a screenplay on time. He would also clash with producer David Wolper, who brought in David Seltzer to do an uncredited rewrite, as they needed Dahl's name to market the movie. After Dahl left, they started to make their own changes. This, of course, felt like a personal insult to Dahl. Perhaps the biggest change was shifting the focus from the young Charlie to the colorful, eccentric Willy Wonka. It also added musical numbers and more comedy, something that Dahl hated. Donald Sturrock, a friend and biographer of his, said, quote, "He felt it was a little too saccharine. I picked up from other people that he found it too sappy and sentimental," end quote. Dahl also did not like Wilder as Wonka. He wanted an English actor, Spike Milligan, who was turned down for being too weird. Wilder was whimsical, but according to Sturrock, Dahl wanted somebody more British. Alas, according to the deal that he had signed, the producers could do whatever they wanted. They hewed as closely as they could to the original book, but, as is always the case, changes were made. Dahl would eventually make peace with his books getting movie adaptations, saying, quote, "The thing is with films, it's just easier to sign a deal, give them the rights, and then assume they're going to do something ghastly with it, because they usually do, and it's way too stressful to try and get involved," end quote. Despite being a flop in the theaters, its long life on TV and home media earned it a devout following. Wilder's portrayal is iconic at this point, and while Dahl certainly didn't like it, the same cannot be said for the millions that do. 1964's Mary Poppins, directed by Robert Stevenson and adapted from Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers, first published in 1934, is, like Willy Wonka, one of the most beloved films of all time. They both share some similarities if you think about it. Beyond being adaptations, their blend of musical comedy that focuses on eccentric characters has been grist for the mill for decades of filmgoers. Unlike Willy Wonka though, Mary Poppins was a wild commercial success. Like Willy Wonka, it was also critically beloved, though even more so. For some, it was hailed as Walt Disney's finest film, and, like Willy Wonka, it was despised by the author of the original book. Walt Disney really wanted to make this movie for his daughters. He spent decades trying to court Travers into letting him adapt it. Hell, there's a movie about it, 2013's Saving Mr. Banks, which, of course, Disneyfies everything that actually happened. One example is a scene in the movie that shows her crying, ostensibly because she's thinking about her past. It's true that she cried at the premiere, but the reason was that she was angry and frustrated with what Disney did to her book. First, she wasn't even supposed to be at the premiere. She didn't receive an invite to it until she embarrassed Disney into getting one. Second, when she saw that the movie was a blend of live action and animation, she detested the result. Third, she also didn't think that Dick Van Dyke and Julie Andrews were right as the leads. And fourth, she didn't like how Disney essentially Disneyfied her. In Travers' words, Mary Poppins was a woman who, quote, "never wastes time being nice," end quote. She's sharp and a bit of a tyrant, not saccharine and sentimental like she found Disney's version to be. She also did not like how she was treated during the production process. Nowadays, the audience expects that the filmmakers will defer to the original author. In the case of the One Piece live-action show, for example, it's expected that the showrunners would work closely with Eiichiro Oda to make something faithful to the manga. It makes sense to think that we would expect Travers to want the same level of control, but as is often the case, She was humored but not listened to. In recordings, Travers was clear about the direction that she wanted the movie to go in and would send countless suggestions and notes that probably received a polite reply but no serious consideration. The premiere was the first that she saw the final film, and the result infuriated her. To be sure, the movie made her wealthy beyond belief. In addition to whatever she got from selling the rights to the book, she also took a cut of the gross, which would translate to millions of dollars in 1960s money. But money doesn't always erase one's true feelings. In a profile of the production written by Caitlin Flanagan for The New Yorker, she notes, quote, "The picture, she thought, had done a strange kind of violence to her work," end quote. Winston Groom was not happy with how things went with Forrest Gump. The novel, which he wrote in 1986, was turned into an Academy Award-winning movie starring Tom Hanks in 1994. In 1995, Groom published a sequel, Gump & Co., and this is how the book begins, quote, "But take my word for it, don't never let nobody make a movie of your life story. Whether they get it right or wrong, it don't matter," end quote. This is probably one of the easiest loathings to understand, because it comes down to a bad contract that screwed the guy out of millions of dollars, as well as changes that he didn't like. Groom was initially paid $500,000 for the rights to the book, and to also write the first 3 drafts of the screenplay, which were closer to his vision. He was also given a 3% share of the net profits. Keep this in mind, because we're going to be returning to it in a bit. Unsatisfied with the script, Robert Zemeckis brought in Eric Roth to rewrite it, and was upfront about the changes, both of which ticked off Groom. In Zemeckis' words, quote, "We flipped the 2 elements of the book, making the love story primary and the fantastic adventure secondary. Also, the book was cynical and colder than the movie. In the movie, Gump is a completely decent character, always true to his word. He has no agenda and no opinion about anything except Jenny, his mother, and God," end quote. This, Groom felt, sanded the rough edges. That would have been fine if he got that 3%. After all, 3% of the film's $678 million gross would have been more than $20 million. That's less than the $40 million that Hanks got, but it's a pretty penny. Unfortunately though, Groom's contract was 3% of net profits. Hollywood accounting screwed the guy over pretty badly. Paramount and the film's producers, through accounting tricks, made it look as though the movie actually lost money, thus there was no profit to share. Groom should have negotiated 3% of the gross. He also resented that he was never mentioned in any of the 6 Oscar-winning speeches that the movie earned. He would sue Paramount and win a 7-figure contract for the film rights to his next movie, Gump & Co., which has been in development hell for decades. Eric Roth turned in a screenplay for the movie on September 10, 2001. We all know what happened next. That said, according to Tom Hanks, the sequel was never seriously considered. Despite being a critical and commercial hit, the movie left an everlasting bad taste for Winston Groom. He would disdain how big the movie and its most famous line about life being like a box of chocolates got to be. In his words, quote, "Why the hell didn't they use my line? Why are they using this line? Well, what do I know? Everywhere I go, people send me chocolates. I hate chocolates," end quote. Alas, most people love chocolates, and most people also loved the movie. Truman Capote wrote 2 very famous books that became very famous movies. 1958's Breakfast at Tiffany's became a 1961 movie starring Audrey Hepburn. 1965's In Cold Blood became a 1967 movie starring Robert Blake, Scott Wilson, John Forsythe, and Paul Stewart. Capote had nothing but good things to say about In Cold Blood. In his words, quote, "As it stands, it runs about 2 hours, but those 2 hours are verbatim from the book and brilliantly done. I cooperated fully with Richard Brooks, who directed the film and did the screenplay, and we never had the slightest disagreement," end quote. Now, let's contrast that with what he said about Breakfast at Tiffany's. When asked by Playboy if he was disturbed by the changes they made from his novella, he said, quote, "Of course, the book was really rather bitter, and Holly Golightly was real, a tough character, not an Audrey Hepburn type at all. The film became a mawkish Valentine to New York City and Holly, and as a result was thin and pretty, whereas it should have been rich and ugly. It bore as much resemblance to my work as the Rockettes do to Ulanova," end quote. Capote was deeply against casting Audrey Hepburn. Instead, he wanted Marilyn Monroe, who had auditioned but was not cast. According to Capote, quote, "Paramount double-crossed me in every way and cast Audrey," end quote. He thought that Monroe would have brought a more nuanced, morally ambiguous presentation to Holly Golightly, who, in Capote's words, was supposed to be an American geisha. He certainly didn't like the more upbeat nature of the movie either. This criticism, of course, did nothing to offset the success of the movie. It made $14 million on a $2.5 million budget, was met with critical acclaim, and earned Hepburn a nomination for Best Actress. At the very least, at least in True Blood seemed like a pretty good experience for Capote. Anthony Burgess is a bit different from the others on this list in that he didn't particularly hate Kubrick's 1971 adaptation of A Clockwork Orange. It wasn't his favorite thing, but he actually gave it proper due. In fact, you might even say he was effusive in his praise. According to the International Anthony Burgess Foundation, he thought that the movie was, quote, technically brilliant, thoughtful, relevant, poetic, mind-opening. It was possible for me to see the work as a radical remaking of my own novel, not as a mere interpretation, and this, the feeling that it was no impertinence to blazon it as Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange, is the best tribute I can pay to the Kubrickian mastery, end quote. This was unlike Burgess's agent and his wife, both of whom wanted to leave a private screening Kubrick held for them. Burgess, despite his overall lack of involvement in the development, was pleased, but he did resent two things. First, Burgess did hate the conversation surrounding the movie. Kubrick famously had the movie pulled from theaters after the English rebuked him, and he started getting death threats. Famously reclusive, Kubrick also wasn't there on the press tour, meaning that a lot of the controversial flack fell on Burgess and the film star Malcolm McDowell. Whenever people asked him about A Clockwork Orange, he never quite knew if they were talking about his book or Kubrick's movie. He also resented the fact that people thought that A Clockwork Orange had somehow influenced copycat crimes. In his words, quote, I was not quite sure what I was defending, the book that had been called a nasty little shocker, or the film about which Kubrick remained silent. Kubrick's achievement swallowed mine whole, and yet I was responsible for what some called its malign influence on the young, end quote. Second, he resented that, beyond the $500 that he sold the rights for, he never saw another dime. To put that into context, the movie made $114 million on a tiny $1.3 million budget over the course of its life. If he had a better agent, he could have gotten a cut of the gross. Burgess was certainly a little displeased at Kubrick not doing his part to defend the film and feeling stiffed financially. In a 1984 stage adaptation that he produced, in the final moment of the play, the stage directions read, quote, a man, bearded like Stanley Kubrick, comes on playing, in exquisite counterpoint, singing in the rain on the trumpet. He is kicked off the stage, end quote. That's certainly one way to get back at Kubrick. There's probably three things that everybody knows about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which was adapted from a Stephen King novel. First, Stanley Kubrick really drove his cast to the brink of insanity. This was the case on several Kubrick movies, but he would really put Shelley Duvall through the ringer, having her do dozens of takes of scenes to get the right kind of fear from her. Two, like many of Kubrick's movies, it was a solid commercial hit, and while critical reception was mixed, it, like all of Kubrick's movies, would eventually come to be hailed as an excellent film. And third, Stephen King hated it. As with Capote, Playboy got the answer out of him. In a 1983 interview with Eric Norden, King lays it all out. First, he says, quote, I think there are two basic problems with the movie. First, Kubrick is a very cold man, pragmatic and rational, and he had great difficulty conceiving, even academically, of a supernatural world. He used to make transatlantic calls to me from England at odd hours of the day and night, and I remember once he rang up at 7 in the morning and asked, do you believe in God? I wiped the shaving cream away from my mouth, thought a minute, and said, yeah, I think so. Kubrick replied, no, I don't think there is a God, and hung up, end quote. Then King continues, quote, the second problem was in characterization and casting. Jack Nicholson, though a fine actor, was all wrong for the part. His last big role had been in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and between that and his manic grin, the audience automatically identified him as a loony from the first scene. But the book is about Jack Torrance's gradual descent into madness through the malign influence of the Overlook, which is like a huge storage battery charged with an evil powerful enough to corrupt all those who come into contact with it. If the guy is nuts to begin with, then the entire tragedy of his downfall is wasted. For that reason, the film has no center and no heart, despite its brilliantly unnerving camera angles and dazzling use of the Steadicam. What's basically wrong with Kubrick's version of The Shining is that it's a film by a man who thinks too much and feels too little, and that's why, for all its virtuoso effects, it never gets you by the throat and hangs on the way real horror should, end quote. King agrees that it's a technically brilliant film, but in the same way that a beautiful car without an engine is technically brilliant. It's great to look at, but it can't take you anywhere. It's all style, no substance. King had written a script for the movie which Kubrick turned down, opting to do his own interpretation, which might have also played a role in King's disdain. It was also a deeply personal book for Stephen King, who partly based Jack Torrance on himself, an alcoholic who had suffered his own descent into madness. From that context, it's like he was seeing himself be twisted on screen. To be fair, the guy has had dozens of his books adapted, and there are plenty of them that he doesn't like. Besides The Shining, he also hated 1992's The Lawnmower Man, which he sued to have his name removed from, 1984's Firestarter, of which he said, quote, "Firestarter is one of the worst of the bunch, even though in terms of story it's very close to the original, but it's flavorless, it's like cafeteria mashed potatoes," end quote. 2017's Dark Tower, of which he said, quote, "I think that they lost a lot of the toughness of it, and it became something where people went to it and said, well, yeah, but it's really not anything we haven't seen before," end quote. And 1986's Maximum Overdrive, directed by none other than Stephen King himself. King called it a moron movie, but had a great reason for why it was so bad. In his words, quote, "I was coked out of my mind," end quote. Ken Kesey, whose One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out in 1962, was a decade-defining book. Hailed as one of the best books of the 20th century, it was a critical and commercial success on its release. Kesey, it's worth noting, was also tricked into volunteering for the CIA's MK Ultra program, which studied how psychedelic drugs affected people. He also worked at the VA hospital in Palo Alto. Both experiences helped him write the book. The book and the movie both look at patients' experiences in psychiatric institutions and criticizes the dehumanizing practices within, as well as what can happen when you're under the care of someone who doesn't really care for you at all. But the book is narrated from the perspective of Chief Bromden, a half-Native American who presents himself as a deaf mute. The narration was struck from the film, which aggravated Kesey. After he left the project, he sued and won a settlement. According to Michael Douglas, who produced the movie, quote, "But like a lot of novelists trying to adapt their own material, it didn't work out. We fell out with him after that. It was our only long-standing, painful issue. We got into a financial dispute. It was silly, but maybe it was his way of defending his ego," end quote. The movie was a resounding success critically and commercially. It made $163 million on a budget of as high as $4.4 million and won the 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. Kesey apparently never actually saw the movie. He just hated it based on what he had heard of it. I'm sure we all know somebody like that. 1997's I Know What You Did Last Summer is a slasher film that was based on Lois Duncan's book published in 1973. It also made Lois Duncan extremely upset. During many adaptations, the author is consulted even if they're not always listened to. Sometimes they stick with the process throughout, but other times they leave early on. Duncan, however, says that she was kept far, far away from the production, likely because the studio knew that she would react poorly to how they butchered her book. Unlike the slasher nature of the movie, her book was a psychological thriller. While the movie captured the theme of consequences and paranoia, they nonetheless took a backseat to what the people wanted to see, which was good old-fashioned killing. The first time that Duncan ever saw the movie apparently wasn't even at the premiere. She literally went to a theater, bought a ticket, and sat down. It's worth me quoting her first experience seeing the movie. Quote, "I went to the theater, bought my ticket and popcorn, and found a seat. Then onto the screen came an insane fisherman carrying an ice hook. He wasn't in my book. I thought, this is a big complex, maybe I've walked into the wrong theater. So I was preparing to leave and then, no, up from below rolled the words, 'I know what you did last summer,' and I thought, that is my book, but who is that man, and what is he going to do with that ice hook? Well, I soon found out. He was going to decapitate my characters. Their heads were flying off and their blood was spurting and everybody was screaming and I was screaming. I was so horrified I couldn't even open my popcorn," end quote. This was also something that was very personal to her. Duncan's daughter, Caitlin, was murdered in 1989 when she was just 18. In Duncan's words, quote, "I was appalled when my book, I Know What You Did Last Summer, was made into a slasher film. As the mother of a murdered child, I don't find violent death something to squeal and giggle about," end quote. That absolutely makes sense, and it's a shame that the producers did not involve her. After her daughter died, Duncan only wrote one more horror novel before, understandably, shifting to lighter material. Duncan passed away in 2016. On August 23, 2021, Albuquerque police apprehended Paul Apodaca, who confessed to the murder of Caitlin Arquette, as well as 2 others. One was a 21-year-old college student, Althea Oakley, who he stabbed to death in 1988. The other was Stella Gonzalez, who he shot also in 1988. All 3 were cold cases. In 1992, Duncan wrote Who Killed My Daughter about her search for answers in the face of the worst news that a parent can ever get. She also founded the Resource Center for Victims of Violent Deaths to help investigate cold cases like her daughter's. It's a tragedy unto itself that she never had closure as to who killed her daughter. After all, as William Makepeace Thackeray wrote, and as Eric Draven quoted in The Crow, "Mother is the name for God on the lips and hearts of little children." Adapting a novel into a movie is an art form unto itself. You obviously can't do a one-to-one adaptation, even if you have more time like you would with a TV show. A lot of the source material will be left on the cutting room floor. That's just the nature of the beast. J.R.R. Tolkien has an excellent quote about this. In Letter 210, concerning a potential adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote that, quote, "The canons of narrative art in any medium cannot be wholly different, and the failure of poor films is often precisely in exaggeration and in the intrusion of unwarranted matter owing to not perceiving where the core of the original lies." End quote. Adaptations fall apart when the core of the original gets lost in translation. For most authors here, that was the issue. The filmmakers, essentially, ended up making fan fiction that they got paid very well for.